So good morning to everyone once again. Hopefully we'll be able to get started after the keynote ran a little bit late. So my name's Reto Meier. I'm a developer advocate for Android at Google. I'm based out of the London office. And a lot of what we do in developer advocacy is to help come to events like these and talk to you guys about the products which we have and the tools which are available to you. Before we get started, it's useful for me to get a bit of a feel for the crowd, to find out what you guys have been working on, how far into the process you all are. So I guess the first question is, how many of you have Android phones? Wow, that's pretty much everyone. Excellent. That's nice. When I came last year, it wasn't every hand by any means. So I guess the next question is, how many of you have downloaded the Android SDK? Again, pretty much everyone. Excellent. How many of you have an app in the market right now? Nice. Excellent. So that's a pretty advanced crowd. So I guess the next question I have is, how many of you who have an app in the market have had that app featured? Congratulations. So for everyone else and for yourself as well, a lot of what we're trying to talk about today, certainly in my presentation, is how to change that. We want to make sure that we have more quality apps. And so it's about trying to give you guys some of the advice, some of the tips, which we find while we look through the apps which we want to feature. So the same advice I'm going to be giving you is essentially a checklist of the things that we look for when we're deciding which apps we want to feature. So to kick things off, as a developer, you have a choice. You can choose to be a good developer, or you can choose to be a lazy developer. And this choice, like with every other choice, has consequences. If you choose to be a lazy developer, not put in that much effort, your app is going to fail. It's going to close. You're going to get 1-star reviews. People are going to uninstall you, and then they're going to write a snarky comment in the Android market. None of this is helpful for you. It's going to mean that your app drops down the ratings. As people are looking through categories, your app is going to be further and further down the list. When they're doing searches, it's not going to be in the first 3 or 4 pages. When that happens, your app may as well not exist. On the other hand, if you build a great app, you put in the time and effort, you're going to get 5 stars. It's going to result in your app being further up the category listings. There's going to be great comments. You're going to get 250,000 plus downloads, 59,000 positive reviews. It's going to be an app which everyone uses and everyone wants. And that's really what we're trying to set out to achieve. So this is a little additional incentive. This is a snapshot from one of my apps. And where it gets near vertical is when it got featured. So this should give you an indication of how big a deal that can be. If you get to a particular level of success, if you get featured, if you get promoted in any other way, you can have a huge impact on the number of downloads. And I think fundamentally that's what we're all trying to do, is get more people to download our apps. That's why we're building them. So Android market, I know it's a little bit of a sore point. It certainly was last time I was here. I don't expect that that's changed a lot. So I expect to cop a bit of abuse for this during the day. But we have recently expanded. So at least here in the Czech Republic, you're able to buy apps. So I think that's a start. We're looking to introduce seller support as well. So as we say, it is a big priority. It is something which takes a lot more time than we would like. But it is something which is a top priority for us and we will continue to work on. So, the agenda. I want to talk about the 5 things you shouldn't do, the 5 things you should do, talk a little bit about how to measure the success in doing those things, and then I'm going to finish off with a couple of quite practical examples with a lot of code that sort of show how to do some things which we tend to find are quite common, but a lot of people don't do in the best ways that they could. So we're going to go through some of those as well. So, the first is the 5 things you should not do. The first of those is sloth. So be fast, be responsive. Your mobile users have absolutely no patience. They expect things to happen now. They expect it to happen immediately. The sort of user that I think of when we talk about sort of your prototypical user, the person you're expecting to use your app, has no idea what it does. They're probably using it while they're doing something else. How many of you are using your phones right now? Yeah, go on. I'm not going to be offended. You can be honest. Yeah, exactly. This is the sort of situation. It's people walking down the street on the bus. They've heard about your app. They're just killing time, browsing through things. They're at a conference listening to a speaker saying stuff they already know. So it's a case of expect your users to not be treating your app as the primary thing. And in those sorts of terms, speed and responsiveness is absolutely vital because they don't have the patience. If your app takes too long, they will find a different app that does the same thing, which happens faster. So in terms of performance, what you need to remember is that you're working in a really resource-constrained environment. The CPU is comparatively not powerful. You don't have a lot of memory. All of these sorts of things are going to make small efficiency changes have massive impact on performance. So fundamentally, the thing about Android you need to remember is if you can get away with not doing something, don't do it. If you can get away with not allocating memory, don't do it. So anything you can do to sort of optimize those things are absolutely vital. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about performance. You're all engineers, so you understand how to write efficient code. I just want to emphasize how important that is. Here are some pointers. If you do want to find out some more specific details, you can check out the performance page at the developer.android.com site. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but again, you'll see that they're pretty similar in what they're talking about. Avoid creating objects, avoid doing work that you don't have to. You're going to hear this over and over again when we're talking about performance and efficiency. For me, I think what's even more important when you're looking at how to develop your app to make it more usable is responsiveness. The difference is, what we're talking about here is you don't want to have those delays, right? You don't want to have the beach balls, the loading dialogues, all those sorts of things. It's just not going to fly with mobile users. So wherever possible, you need to avoid things like dialogues. You need to avoid blank screens which just say loading. Find ways to be able to present as much information as you can, as quickly as you can. So a good example of this is news apps, where right off the bat you should be downloading the low bandwidth content. Get the news headlines. The first 10 news headlines should be up as soon as the app loads. And then at the same time, you want to start preloading things which are going to be one click away. So the next page in the scroll, any tab options, anything which should be behind those tabs, you should be loading straight away. So as soon as the user starts clicking things, they can read things. Images, slightly higher bandwidth. These are the sorts of things that you may want to start to load more slowly. So get all the text in place and then start dynamically loading the images. Same way that you can get these infinitely scrolling lists, right? So you scroll down the headlines, each of the pictures is an empty space, and then as they come into view, that's when you load them in. So it's trying to find ways to make your app seem faster than it is, present as much as you can, so that no one ever has to wait. The last thing you want to do is have any sort of modal dialogue if you can possibly get away with not having it. How many of you have seen one of these? I'm sure a few more, yeah. Okay, so if your user sees one of these, this is a force close dialog. It happens if your app is unresponsive for a certain amount of time. If you see one, if your users see one, then you've already got a big black mark against your name. Oh, come on. It's going to make life a little bit more difficult. That's kind of the same thing. So that's the sort of thing you want to avoid, is when the user clicks something, nothing happens. On mobile, it's even worse. So you have 5 seconds to get to avoid that. Okay, so the user clicks the screen, you have 5 seconds before force close comes out. What that means is that this isn't a goal. You shouldn't be trying to just get in under that 5-second mark. In reality, you have around 100 to 200 milliseconds before the user starts to feel like your app is sluggish, like the system is going too slowly. So that's the goal you should be looking for, 100 to 200 milliseconds. So the way that you achieve that is you really need to move everything which isn't directly dealing with the UI into a background thread, so that nothing at all can possibly delay the UI thread unless it's absolutely necessary for updating that. And so to do that, we've introduced a pattern, or a class in fact, which can help make that a lot easier. Because a lot of the tricky part of this is how do you synchronize threads, how do you do the UI updates without messing everything up. Async task is one method of doing this. So it works quite simply. Everything which needs to happen in the background gets called within do-in background. So all of the time-consuming network lookup, database lookup, all of those sorts of things happen in do-in background. You call post progress whenever you're ready to update the UI in some way. So whether that's updating the ticker which says 10 of 15 done, all of that sort of stuff can be done there. All of the arguments here are parameterized, so you can pass in, you can specify whatever parameters you want to pass in. On post progress is synchronized to the UI thread, which means that you don't need to do any thread synchronization there. You can deal directly with the UI of your application within that, and it handles all of the messy thread synchronization for you. Similarly, once you return from doing background, on-post execute is again synchronized to the UI thread. This is where you can either update the UI to handle all of the things which you've been doing in the background. So this is a really good way of being able to sort of move all of the background stuff into a separate thread and still give you the ability to update the UI correspondingly. So the only thing worse than an app which is slow and unresponsive is one which uses all of the system resources, makes everything else slow and unresponsive. So it's really important that you use those system resources as responsibly as possible. What that means is try to conserve those resources. Try and update things as infrequently as possible. Try and use the battery as little as you possibly can get away with. And don't try and fight the way that the system is trying to manage those resources. So there are ways within Android that you can get over the heap limit within Dalvik if you really want to. There are ways that you can stop your app from getting killed if it's in the background and the system needs more resources. Now, there are circumstances where that's necessary. And in those circumstances, by all means, go ahead. But what you need to be very careful of is not doing them just because it makes your life a little bit easier if you have a bit more memory. Because what you're then doing is starving the rest of the system. You're making the whole phone a less useful experience. And users are going to notice this. They're going to try and figure out what app is causing these problems, and they're going to want to install you. So it's short-term gain, but in the long term, it's going to take you down that path of uninstalls and snarky comments. As well as things you shouldn't do, there's the things you should do. So you should try and use as much information should be shared between different components of your applications and, where possible, between different apps. So if you have content providers, if you're downloading things from the internet, storing them in a database, see if you can share that information, certainly between multiple of your own applications, but potentially with other people as well. It's going to make the whole experience better for users because they're not going to have spent their battery essentially downloading the same information over and over again. And the same thing with things like alarms and services. Anything that you can do to minimize battery use is going to have a massive impact in terms of how the user is able to use your app and how enjoyable an experience it is for them. How many of you know what a wake lock is? Only a couple. Okay. So I may actually regret showing the rest of you this, but this is a wake lock. What a wake lock does is it helps to lock system resources, so you're able to force the CPU to stay on when the screen goes off, or in fact you're able to prevent the screen from turning off completely. So there are some very specific times where this is really important. If you need to complete a particular task, even when the screen is off, then you want to hold a CPU wake lock. If you've got something like if you've created a movie player, for example, then you're going to want to be able to lock the screen on, because otherwise it's going to time out and go blank in 15 seconds. That's not a great movie watching experience. So there are times when you need to use them. The way it happens is you specify the kind of wake lock you want, acquire it, and then when you're done with it, you release it. So this is what it can do. Keep the CPU running, keep the screen on. It does, however, drain your battery really, really effectively. So it's really important that when you do use wake locks, you use them in a responsible way. So what does that mean? Really think about, do you need to have a wake lock? Do you need to force the battery to keep going? Does the CPU need to be on, or can this wait until the next time the screen turns on? If you do need to use it, try and use the minimum level possible. For most cases, the most you're ever going to need is a partial wake lock keeping the CPU on. And in fact, what I would say is never use the screen ones, because there is a better way of doing that. So rather than holding a wake lock, which requires a special permission, you can actually ask the window manager to manage this for you. So by specifying the keep screen on flag, what this does is it lets the window say, okay, so this particular activity, the screen needs to be on all the time. So again, for a movie player, this is perfect. So then the window manager is going to handle all of that for you. You don't need to ask the permission. You don't need to worry about holding a wake lock when you don't actually need one. This is a great way to let the system manage it for you in a really effective, efficient way. Don't be the person which makes your users pull the battery, right? Don't fight them. Your users are what you're building these apps for. So everything you can do to make their life easier should be absolutely your goal. And in fact, the user experience really should be your #1 priority. You live and die by the user's experience. And so you really need to make sure that they find it enjoyable right from the word go, right from the start. They should always feel as though they've always wanted this app. Now that they have it, they can't imagine not having it on their phone. That's the sort of thing which you should be aiming for. And so it's really important that you try and make that positive experience. So what does that mean? It means respect user expectations, particularly around things like navigation and native experience. Respect their preferences. These are the sorts of things which is going to make them feel like they're working with your app, not that they're having to fight against it. Navigation flow, I think, is really one of the most important points, so I want to spend a little bit of time on that. In particular, there's the back button. Now, the way the back button works is really quite simple. It's exactly the same as the back button on your browser. Every time you hit back, you should go to the previous screen that you saw. You should never see anything new when you hit back. If you hit back on a website and it took you to the home page of the site that you were on, that would be weird. Right? If it's a previous website, you should go there. If it's a previous page on the same site, that's where it should take you. The back button on Android works exactly the same. If you're using the conventional activity stack, it will do all of this for you. Every time you create a new activity, put it on top of the stack, hitting back just removes it. But if you're building something like a web browser or a game, where you're using the same screen, the same window, the same activity, and just inserting different information, then you'll need to override the back button behavior to make it work in the way that users expect, which will mean moving it back to the previous screen, the previous configuration. So it's important that you really think about the navigation flow and make sure that it works in the exact same way that users expect. And trackball navigation is a similar thing. Not every phone has a trackpad or a D-pad. There's a lot of devices which just have touchscreens now. And it's tempting from a developer perspective to just develop for those touchscreens. But there's two problems with that. There's no guarantee that in the future every Android device is going to have a touchscreen. So you want to make sure that users are able to navigate however they choose to. For me, living in London, and I'm sure it's the same here, when it gets cold in winter, I really like the trackpad because it means I can use my phone without taking off my gloves, which is a bonus on the way to work. So it's all really the same sort of message, which is your users have been using your phones, using their phones, I should say, longer than they've been using your app. So you need to make sure that your application works with them, that it's providing a service in the way that they expect. If they expect to be able to use the trackball because that's what they use their other apps for, your app should work the same way. But of course, it's not just navigation flow that forms user expectations. There's a whole bunch of other things. One of those which I like to mention is the status bar. So the status bar sits at the top. You can hide that on your app, make your app full screen. And there are circumstances where that's great. If you're building an immersive game, if you're building a video experience or an e-learning app, then it's vital that the user have no distractions. For the most part, though, for me at least, the status bar is really important. It's got the time, it's got all of my incoming emails, voicemails. That's what I use my phone for predominantly, as a message center. So as soon as the status bar gets hidden, I'm not able to use my phone in the way that I expect to be able to. So what I would say is, again, think really carefully before you do that. It's an extra 20 pixels or so, but do you really need that? Is it part of the experience? Because generally speaking, it's not something that you should need to do. And all of these things are similar. You want to use the native icon so that users don't have to learn what each of the menu icons or each of the buttons on your screen does. If you've got the same preferences icon as everyone else, it's going to be that much easier for people to learn how to use your app. And you want to make that learning curve as low as possible. So far what I've talked about are sort of implicit contracts with the user. It's making sure your app works in the way that they expect it to. User preferences take this to a different level. Here we're talking about ways in which users have specifically told you how they expect your application to work. And so for things like anything to do with location, privacy, data transfer, these are really ways which you can make sure that the user is able to control how your app works. And there's going to be financial and privacy implications for this, and sometimes legal. So it's really important that you obey user preferences wherever you can. One of the ways in which this happens is that you can, as a user, specify whether or not you want data to be able to be transferred in the background. The thing is, this is actually specified by the user within the system framework, but it's up to each app to check on this setting and only then transfer data if this setting is enabled. So if you do have an app which is transferring data when an activity isn't visible, then you should be using the connectivity manager, like I've shown here, to find out whether that background data transfer setting is enabled or not. Now, in some circumstances, your app won't make sense if you can't transfer this data, and the Android market is an example of this. So in that case, if you see this, there's nothing to say that you can't pop up a message saying, actually, this application doesn't work without background data transfer. Please click here to turn it on. And that's totally fine. But it is important that you do obey those preferences if a user has specified them. So, arrogance. We talked about avoiding being hostile to users. This is about being hostile to the system. I talked a little bit about this earlier on, when I said try not to fight the way that the system is managing resources. And that's really what it's all about. One of the things we want to tell people is don't use undocumented APIs. And it's something which deserves emphasis. The reason why we ask you not to do this isn't because we want to keep things secret. It's a totally open stack. You can see all of the source code. You can find every API that exists, whether it's documented or not. The reason why we don't want you to use them is really it's for your own benefit. It's a case of anything undocumented is essentially a way for us to say it's not yet supported. It means that chances are, in a future release of Android, this is going to change. Anything which is undocumented but available is essentially us saying this is something which we think is going to be useful, this is something which we want to support, and this is something which is going to come soon. So you can think of it as a sneak preview of APIs which aren't yet available but soon will be. Why don't we want you to use them? Again, because it's going to break your app. We've had a number of examples in the past where we've had these undocumented APIs, people have used them to create some cool new functionality. A new version of Android comes out and it breaks. And then you're stuck trying to figure out how do you fix this? How do you use the new APIs while maintaining support for the old versions? It gets really, really messy really, really quickly, particularly as there's no guarantee that you're going to have a phone with the latest build in time to be able to test this sort of stuff. We often release the phones and the new versions of Android, the SDK, at about the same time. So you're really sort of putting yourself at real risk of having an app which suddenly doesn't work. Again, we want you to behave consistently with the system, and really a lot of the time this is what we're talking about with hostility, but it's also trying to find ways in which you can work with the way that the resources are managed. And one of the sections later, one of the practical examples, I'm going to talk about how to work with the system when you've got background apps, when you're using services to be more efficient. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the application lifecycle model. And this is about as fundamental as it gets for Android. Understanding how this works is really central to be able to create a really good user experience. And so without sort of belaboring the point too much, I do want to make sure that you guys are thinking about what happens when your app is no longer visible. When it stops being the primary activity, what do? You should always be saving state. You should always be saving every instance so that when it pops into the background, if the system kills it, because you've been using the browser, which uses up all the available memory and inevitably kills everything in the background, you want to make sure that when the user switches back to your app, it's there, it's ready, it's waiting, just as it has been. So for them, it's a totally transparent experience. They don't know whether your app's died or not. They just know that switching back to it, they have what they expect. They're able to get on with their work quickly and easily. And the same sort of thing goes for landscape and portrait views. So you can lock your app so that it only works in portrait view. It's great because it means you don't need to worry about modifying the layout for the landscape view. The thing is, there's a bunch of devices, particularly things like tablets, like the Galaxy Tab, or any device which has a slide-out keyboard, where landscape mode is the primary way that people are going to use it. And so if you're forcing them to use their phone in a way that they're not used to, again, it's just a way for them to be less inclined to use your app, to be more inclined to uninstall it. So wherever possible, try and work with it, try and make your app so that it's going to be usable, available, and optimized for as many different types of devices as you can. So I want to talk about discrimination. I want to suggest that you design your apps for every possible device, and there are a lot of them. We've got everything from the tiny Sony Ericsson Mini to the regular sort of Nexus 1 sized phones, right up to the Galaxy Tab, the 7-inch Galaxy Tab. I think it's fair to say that we're all expecting more devices with bigger screens, smaller screens, different variations of the above. What that means is that when you're designing your layouts, when you're designing your user interfaces, your user experience, you can't really make any assumptions about screen sizes. Even if you know that it's a WVGA screen, it can be a difference of 54 pixels between, say, the Nexus 1 and the Motorola Droid. So you really need to always be using the relative layouts. You always need to be using device-independent pixels, thinking about how your app is going to scale. If you have if you can imagine your device, your app running on a device with a landscape screen, something like the Galaxy Tab, you're going to have a bunch of extra white space. So it's really important to think about, how should my app work with that? Is it just going to scale, or should I be introducing a new UI element to take advantage of that extra space? And the good news is you can optimize for those things quite simply using the resources hierarchy. So again, you can specify different layouts for each of the screen sizes, and you can go a step further by creating different layouts specifically for, say, large screen devices in landscape mode. So you can do all of these things to try and make sure that your app looks as good as it possibly can, provides the best user experience, no matter what device the user is currently using. And that gets even more interesting when you're talking about things like Google TV. Now, not only do you have a much bigger physical screen size, but you've also got some pretty significant hardware differences. Now, chances are the Google TV is not going to have a GPS. It probably won't have accelerometers, because it gets a little bit awkward to move. A lot of the hardware which we're currently used to, microphones, telephony, all these sorts of things, they're just not going to exist on these TVs. And the TVs are just the first that we know of. Chances are Android is going to be expanding into much more diverse hardware as the compatibility definition gets looser and looser. So what that means is you really need to think about what hardware is essential for your app and how you can work with that. So the way this works is by using these users features. Now, the technique I'm going to recommend here is a little bit overkill. Generally speaking, it's going to assume that all of the hardware is optional. So you would only really need to specify the required hardware. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, particularly around the camera, and I like this technique because it really makes you think about how hardware is being used in your app. So the first step is to go through and list every API which you use within your app. Then you go through and you find out which ones do I need for this app to work. So if you're building something which absolutely needs to have location, then you say that this is required. Do not display this app on a device which doesn't have some way of knowing where it is. Then you go through and you can specify all of the things which you don't need. And for this particular example, I'm saying, well, I do need to know where I am, but I don't actually care how I find out. So if GPS is available, fine. If it's using network or Wi-Fi, that's fine too. And you can do exactly the same thing with things like compasses or microphones, where you're saying, we like speech input, that's one of the functions that we offer, but if it's not there, the app will still work. So having done this, this is what controls whether or not your app is going to be visible on different devices on the Android market. Within your code, you then need to go through and find out, well, of this optional hardware, how much of it is actually here? And so in this particular example, say you're building an app which shows you where things are. It's a restaurant finder, something like that. And so within your list, you have a little compass arrow which points you in the right direction. It's a nice UI element. But if there is no compass, your app will still work. But you don't want to have just a stationary compass element. So what you would do here is use the package manager to check whether the compass sensor exists. And if it does, then you can display the compass rows. And if it doesn't, then you remove it. And what you're doing is making sure that not only is your app functional, but it's also optimized for each of those devices. So I could go in more detail. I'm not going to. Christian Kursk is giving a talk later today. He's going to go into much more detail about the implications of different kinds of hardware, different kinds of versions. So I'll leave it to him to go into some more detail. So that's the 5 things that you should not do. These are the 5 things that you should do. The 5 glorious virtues. So we start with beauty. So again, I'm going to ask you guys a question. I've got a dark slide, so I'm going to have to peer into the darkness. But do we have any designers in the audience today? A couple? That's not bad. I think that's possibly the equal most we've had so far at an event. Thank you very much for coming. For the rest of you, I'm going to assume that you're engineers. So I'm going to ask you, how many of you build and create your own assets and layouts for your apps? Okay, perfect. Now keep your hands up. All right. Now, how many of you think that you would be able to get a job as a designer? Okay. Those of you who still have your hands up, excellent. For the rest of you, this is the key piece of advice. Now, I understand this isn't always practical. A lot of you guys, certainly myself when I was starting out, if you've got a great idea or a very small company or you're just developing for yourself, it's not always as simple as spend money on another employee who can make your apps look good. But what I want to emphasize is how important it is to really think about that user experience. And if you do have the ability, to find a designer who is willing to work with you, a user experience person which is willing to help, it can be absolutely invaluable. Here's an example. So this is an app that I built around earthquakes. And it's quite straightforward. You've got your list of earthquakes on a traditional list view. I've customized the list item a little bit, and a map there which displays the area of effect for each of the earthquakes. It's simple, it's effective, but it's also quite plain. Roman Urich, one of my colleagues in the Android advocacy team, has a little bit more skill with pixel pushing than I do, so he offered to do a redesign, and this is what he came up with. And you can see straight away that it's actually very similar in terms of what it does. It's a list of earthquakes, and it's a map which has them. But it looks that much more appealing. He's introduced branding elements. He's used the action bar there, which is a popular and familiar sort of UI paradigm for Android, and just generally made it a lot more of an appealing experience. And it's really important, particularly us as engineers. We tend to prioritize how well something works, what it does. But this is the sort of thing which really drives people to stick with your app. You take TweetDeck, for example, right? They have a hugely popular Android Twitter client. It wasn't the first, and it's certainly not the only Twitter client, but it looks gorgeous. It works really well. And that sort of user experience, the design element to that, I think is crucial to the success that they've had and the speed in which they've had it. So in terms of practical advice, you really need to pay attention to things like screen resolutions. Make sure that all of your assets are scalable and scaled and optimized. Having just recently started playing with a Samsung Galaxy Tab, you straight away start to see people which haven't optimized their assets for high resolution devices. Everything starts to look jagged around the edges. And it straight away makes you think that, oh, this app isn't really designed to run on this device, or this app isn't really professional because I haven't spent the time to make it look good. So start with vectors, start with high resolution raster art, and then optimize it for each of the different resolutions. It's really important. Again, with the resolution independence, it's more vital than anything that you don't have assets being stretched and pulled out of shape. So it's really important that you don't make those assumptions. And from an engineering perspective, we've got a couple of tools, Layout Opt and Hierarchy Viewer. And what they do is it makes sure that once you've created this complicated layout, which looks great, works great, you've made it as efficient as possible so that you haven't slowed your entire app down for the sake of making it look good. So yeah, those two tools are a great way to try and find out some of that information. Further details is by Roman Urich, who's got the session straight after me here. As I said, he did the redesign. He's going to talk about not just UI, but just the overall user experience, how to make people think about your app in a positive way. So generosity. This is the idea of being able to share data. So this is using intents. And intents, I think, is something which hopefully most of you are familiar with. It's a way to be able to leverage other people's apps within your own, or to be able to share your functionality with other people. And it's, I think, a really, really powerful technology within Android, which hasn't been taken advantage of fully. So I want to give you an example using whereopentable to sort of explain how this works. So where is a restaurant listing guide. As you can see, you can go through. This is from a screenshot from when I was last visiting San Francisco. And you can go through and find the restaurant you want. And then when you're ready to book, you hit the reserve now. And what that does is it fires an intent into the system, which says, I would like to book a table. And it specifies the URI of this particular restaurant. And the system goes through and tries to find, are there any apps which can do this? If you have OpenTable installed, then that's what will come up. And OpenTable is just going to get launched as it would a sub-activity within your own application, has all the details pre-filled for the restaurant which we chose in Where, and lets you do that booking. Once you've completed that, it's going to drop you straight back into Where. Totally seamless, without anyone having to do sort of hardcore API engineering work. And the way it works is really, really simple. So as you can see, what we're essentially doing is starting an activity for a result using an intent. And that intent is specified using an action that you want to perform and an amount of data that you want to perform that action on. And in this particular case, the action is hotel booking, and the data that we're going to perform it on is a hotel name specified by hotel name and then the hotel name. So again, like I said in the earlier example, once you're ready to book that hotel, you call start activity. We then pass through each of the manifests for all the different apps currently installed on the device. And here we can see straight away that there is an activity which has the action book action specified, and it has the data specified in the same format that we require, so hotel and name. So great. The system says, I found an activity, I'm going to start it. The activity starts, and you can see what you want to do is grab the intent that caused this activity to launch, pull out the action, pull out the data, and we're able to parse the hotel name really easily. Now, this URI can be specified in whatever way you want, so you can have multiple amounts of data in the URI. You can include extra things within the extras, so an affiliate code, a booking reference, any of those sorts of things. Pull out that data, populate your UI, and then you can display exactly the form you want. So if you're a hotel booking service, chances are you don't care how people got to the booking screen, as long as they book. So this is a way for you to be able to incorporate your booking functionality into other people's apps. And if you're one of these other apps, it's a way of being able to add hotel bookings to your app. Now, this is a very specific example, but you should be able to see if you've got any sort of app which you're trying to drive users either to continue using or to perform a particular action, this is a way to enrich that experience, drive more people to that final screen, or keep people using your app for a longer amount of time. Next thing I want to talk about is ubiquity. This is a way to make your app more than just an icon in the launcher. So by default, you install the app, shows up in the launcher, and that's the only way you can get to it. Now, most Android users have somewhere between 40 and 80 apps installed on their devices. This is the only way that you can get to your app. This isn't a great return, right? You've got a lot of other apps who you're competing with. People need to think to load your app specifically. So what we're trying to suggest is use the power of Android to be able to make your app ubiquitous, make it available everywhere. I probably open most of the apps that I use through either the desktop or the home screen widgets or notifications. So an incoming tweet or an interesting news headline in a widget. So again, think about how you can surface the information that you have within your application to make it more useful, more interesting, to drive people into your app. Widgets, I think, are probably the most obvious, particularly if you have any kind of data that you want people to see. Create a widget, create a couple, give them options to be able to have that data on their home screen. Use the quick search box to surface your search results. People are going to be searching for things on their phones. It's one of the main things that they do. If you've got your data coming up within the quick search box, it's a really quick way to drive people into that. People like Spotify and grocery stores have used this to great effect to be able to drive more traffic into their apps directly from the home screen. Live folders, wallpapers, and again, the intent receivers I was just talking about. It's a way of being able to get your app launched from within other people's apps. And again, I'll say it again, the notifications I think are a really powerful way of being able to drive that traffic. It brings your app immediately to mind. One of the key things that I want to talk about as well, there's 100,000 apps in the market now. That's what I was saying this morning, right? That means that you can build anything you like. There's no process by which Google is going to look at your app and say whether or not it's a great enough idea to put in the market. But just because you can build anything doesn't really necessarily mean that you should. You should be trying to create something which solves a problem, something which people are going to want to use. And that's the question you should ask yourself is, why are people installing this application? What problem does it solve? Now, it can be a proper utility type issue, or it can be I get bored on my commute, and so I want to be able to play a game. Angry Birds isn't useful in the conventional sense, but it's very interesting, very captivating, and it helps kill time in a way which blows everything else out of the water. So this is it. You know, try and think of why is someone using this? Why are they downloading my app? Why do I want them to keep using it? One of the examples that I use is Accardo. It's a grocery delivery service in London. I'm lazy, and these guys bring food to my house, so this is a great mix. I really like the app because they've done some things here to make their mobile client more useful than the web client. So the first thing it does is it downloads the entire catalog to the phone. So I can shop while I'm in the underground when I don't have data connectivity. As soon as that connection reappears, it synchronizes to the cloud, does my booking, transfers my order, and I'm none the wiser. That I really like. What I also really like is that they've integrated two things from Android using intents. One is a barcode scanner, so I can walk through my kitchen, anything which is running low, I scan it with the phone, it does the text entry for me, so I don't have to type it all in. Similarly, they've built in the voice search, so I can just hit the microphone button on the home screen, it will go through and essentially search for whatever it is that I've asked for. So both of these ways, both of these things are removing the biggest detriment to using a mobile device, text entry. It's a pain. But using this app, I barely need to type anything in. And that makes my life a lot simpler, and it's a way that they've taken something which is already useful online and made it more useful as a mobile app. And those are the sorts of things you guys should be thinking of. If you're incrementally, if you've already got a service on the web, how can I make it a better service on mobile? So what am I saying? Once again, probably for the third time, solve a problem. Find a problem, solve it. And if you are presenting information, try and do it in a way that's really captivating, interesting, something that people enjoy to use. And if if you're creating games, again, try not to do a Me Too. We don't need yet another Bejeweled clone. What we're looking for is new games, new ways to interact with your devices, creating things which people haven't seen before. And that's what creates the buzz, that's what creates the interest. And that's what's going to get you featured, that's what's going to get you talked about on blogs. Fundamentally, we want people to use our apps, that's why we're building them. So try and figure out who is it that should be using this, how can I build something which they're going to be excited by. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how to measure your success. And I think the way to do this is through analytics. Get numbers. Let's start by having a look at some user feedback. So this is some feedback for the earthquake app I showed you earlier. And judging by this, there's a problem with the HTC Evo, which is a shame because I really tested on that. But then this user says that it's great, so okay, so maybe there's not a problem. This person wants the SD card support. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, there's a widget in this app, which means that you can't allow installing to SD card if there's a widget. Now, we all know that, but users apparently don't. Fine. This is the very first thing in settings, and this is an email someone sent to me this morning saying, "How do I turn off the noise?" It's the first option in settings. Oh, how do I get to settings? You press the menu button. So again, not everyone has used their phones for as long as you. They can't necessarily follow instructions. They don't understand how to do common things. These two people hated the app. Okay, fine, fair enough. So it's not very popular. Maybe I should have come up with something better. These two people loved it. They think it's awesome. Geologists think it's great. So what does this tell me? This is a lot of different user feedback. Why did I show you all of this? It's because I'm trying to say that user feedback isn't always the most reliable way to judge how your app is doing and what you should be spending time on. Their feedback contradicts each other. They don't understand the framework limitations like widgets stopping you from being able to do SD card installation. They don't understand instructions. The feedback they provide is really unhelpful. It's slow. Great, slow in which way? Which parts are slow? This isn't helpful. And they lie. They tell falsehoods. They tell you things that are not true. They say, this doesn't work on Droid, and it does work on Droid. You've tested it 1,000,000 times. So am I saying ignore what users say? Absolutely not. User feedback is still one of the most useful techniques you have to prioritize what you're doing, to figure out what are the strengths and weaknesses of your apps, where should you be spending more development time. But just as important is analytical information. So this is a screen grab of, again, the earthquake app. And you can see here that I've put a page against pretty much every action that a user can perform. Every time they hit refresh, every time they select a different settings, every time they switch between the map view and the list view, I record that. And you can see straight away that if you have a look at the map and list view numbers, it's pretty similar. So there's not a fundamental difference between, a preference between those two views. So I say, okay, so that's good. I've also marked every exception. And this one in particular is a bit of a concern if you look at the number of instances of that. So you can not only find out demographic information, but you can also find out where are exceptions occurring, where are there bugs, what parts of your app are people using, and which ones aren't. Sometimes you might find that something you thought wouldn't be popular is actually being used quite a lot, or something you thought people would enjoy and they don't seem to be discovering it. So that may imply that you need to change the way your user interface is designed to be able to promote and surface some of these functions. So what does analytics give you? It gives you the ability to find user demographics. If you're trying to decide which countries should I internationalize for, use the analytics. If you've got a lot of users in Spain, a Spanish translation is probably more important than anything else. It's able to give you that, give you information about the screen sizes that people are using. You're able to find out usage patterns. How are people using my app? Where should I be putting my time and effort? And again, exception and error handling, which I think is a great way of being able to find that information. It's important to note that the example I gave is Google Analytics for mobile applications. If you choose to use that, fantastic. If you want to use something else, Flurry, something you've baked yourself, all of that's totally supported. There aren't any restrictions around the sorts of packages you want to use. If you did use Google Analytics for mobile, you can see it's actually quite straightforward. You call start, specifying your analytics code, and then every time you want to track something, you give it an alias, and this comes up just as a web page would in Google Analytics. And then to try and optimize the bandwidth issues, rather than dispatching every time you click on something, the tracker is going to keep all of those together, and you can call dispatch to send that data back to the server. Which means, for what you're doing, if you've got something which is accessing the internet every hour for an update, you can choose to do this dispatch at the same time, minimize the impact on battery and CPU. So, a couple of practical examples. So this is going to get a little more technical, a little more codey. So if you're not comfortable with code, you can spend the next 10, 15 minutes figuring out why you came to a developer conference. So, background updates. So, one of the key things about Android, which we all love, is background updates. The ability to have things running in the background, either concurrently with other apps or happening on an ongoing basis. The thing is, there's a really easy way to make this bad. We don't want to be Accardo, right? We want to be the good guy. We want to make this a pleasant experience. And so, here are some tips for exactly how you would do that. So you start off by letting the runtime kill your background service. And this is what we were talking about earlier in terms of being arrogant, trying to make sure that the system is able to manage those resources as effectively as possible. So what do we mean by that? In Android 2, we introduced onStart command. And this lets you tell the system how your app should respond if it gets killed to be able to give additional resources to other apps. How many of you know what happens if the system runs out of resources and kills a background service? Who knows what happens next? Okay, not many people. What it does is it's going to restart your service pretty much straight away. It's going to kill it just long enough for whatever's in the foreground to be able to respond and get on with it, and then your service gets restarted. So it's actually very difficult for the system to kill a service. What this lets you do, if you specify start not sticky, what you're saying to the system is if you need to kill me, if you need the additional resources that badly, just let me stay dead. Don't restart me. This is great if you're doing things where you're performing a single action, particularly if you're performing that action on a regular basis. If you're doing updates every 5 minutes, you probably can get away with skipping one. You may choose to say, okay, I'm going to keep track, and once we've skipped 3 updates, then I'm going to return start sticky. I'm going to make sure that this action is completed. But this lets you be able to help the system out, right? It's not a direct benefit to your app, but it's a benefit to the system. And anything which makes the system run more smoothly is going to make your users happier. If you're worried about backwards compatibility, it's straightforward enough to maintain onStart as well. OnStart command simply isn't going to get called on devices prior to 2.0. So by doing this and moving all of the handling code into a separate method, you're able to have the best of both worlds. The next step is to kill your own service. Right? The system can kill it, but you should already be doing this by calling stop self. In most circumstances, services should be short running, they should execute a particular task, and they should end as soon as that task has been completed. The last thing we want is services which are just running with a timer in the background, which is going to go off every hour. It means that your service is going to be loaded, your application is going to be loaded, and as I just said, it's actually quite hard for the system to kill a service. So whenever possible, finish the action you need, call stop self, kill that service. This is a pattern using sort of the 3 things we've talked about in terms of onStart command to let the system kill your service, the async task class to move all of that time-consuming processing into a background thread, and then as soon as we've finished, as soon as that execution is completed, we're calling stop self. So you see, every step of the way here, we're trying to minimize the amount of time that this service is up, and when it is running, we're trying to minimize the impact that it has on the system overall. The next point is to use alarms and intent receivers. So I've just talked about not having a timer running in your service on an ongoing basis. This is how you avoid that. You use alarms and intent receivers. And hopefully many of you are already familiar with these. The beauty of alarms is that you can schedule things. You can schedule polling without having to have your app running. You don't need a service, you don't need an activity, you don't need the application. Everything can be totally out of memory, but having set an alarm on a recurring basis, it will broadcast an intent, which you can set an intent receiver to listen for, and have your polling work that way. And this is how it works. This is what an intent receiver looks like. So what we're listening for in the intent receiver is for an action called refresh this. And once that receiver is triggered, it's going to open your broadcast receiver, which we've specified there as my receiver, and that's going to be able to do something. Now, generally the pattern here is something like polling. So we here refresh this, we start a service which does the update poll and then stops self. So you've got an intent receiver calling a service which then kills itself. The way you trigger those alarms is within your app. Using the alarm service, the alarm manager, you specify a new intent, package that within a pending intent, and then you specify how should this alarm trigger. So here we're saying that it should wake up the device. So every 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, wake up the device, execute this and broadcast this intent, which is then going to launch the intent receiver, start that service, do the update. The key here is in set repeating, where we're specifying the type, saying in 15 minutes, every 15 minutes, fire the intent. Now, there is a slight problem with this, because what happens if you've got a whole bunch of apps, and they've all got 15 minutes between when they get triggered, and they're all starting about 1 or 2 minutes after each other, and they all take a minute or so to do their update. Well, what you find then is you have a phone which is constantly turned on, because every background app is waking the device up and getting it to execute this. Happily, there is a way around it. You can use inexact alarms. It works exactly the same way as a repeating alarm. The difference is, by calling set inexact repeating, it lets the system phase shift all of them. So if it can see that there's a whole bunch of alarms which are all set to go off almost at the same time, give or take a few minutes, it's going to shift them so they all go off at the same time. It has a dramatic impact in terms of saving your battery life, so that everything happens at once rather than the device being kept constantly awake. The last trick here is to ignore all of the polling stuff completely and use cloud-to-device messaging. It lets you work under a push mechanism rather than polling. So rather than doing it all on a device, you can rely on a server doing this for you. It works really well for targeted updates. So rather than flooding every user of your app every 15 minutes to download something, you're telling them specifically, you have a new voicemail, you have a new email, you need to update from the system. It's low bandwidth, it's using the same exact implementation as Gmail, so it's no additional cost to the system. And this is how it works. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to give you an idea of how it works. You start by registering your application on a user's device with the cloud-to-device messaging server. You do that by doing this. Like with everything, you specify a particular intent, and then you call start service, calling that intent, and that's going to then broadcast this message to the cloud-to-device messaging server. You can see that we've got two extras here. We're specifying the app, and we're specifying who the sender is, and that represents you. So when you go to the cloud-to-device messaging site, register an account, this is the name that you put in there. And it's a way to identify your quotas. Once they get sent to the server, it's going to send back a registration ID, and that ID uniquely identifies that device, your particular app on that particular device. You listen for that registration ID by, again, using an intent receiver. You can see we're listening for the registration action. And then once that launches, your own receiver then is going to have to pull out that registration ID. So you pull that out of the bundle which comes through. The reason you need that is because you then are going to send that back to your server. And the registration ID is the way that you're able to address a message to a particular device. So your server now needs to basically keep a hash between usernames and registration IDs, so that if you want to send a message to a particular user, a particular device, it's that ID which is the address. So the next stage of that, at this point you're all hooked up. You've got the registration ID, the device is set up with the cloud server. So as soon as you want to send a message to your particular device, you send that message to the cloud-to-device messaging server instead, using that registration ID as an address. Now, the easiest way to do that is to use the Android C2DM project, which is part of or distributed as part of Dave Burke's Chrome to Phone open source project. And that makes it much, much easier. Right? So instead of having to handle all the handshaking yourself, you simply call send with retry, specify the target address. The 4 nulls are extras which you're able to package. So it's, excuse me. Those 4 nulls are extras, so it's a very small package that you can send, but you can send some additional information. Excuse me. So, at that point, the messaging server sends that message straight to the device. And then at the device, you're just listening for that message. So again, you're listening for receive, and you're able to then pull out the data that's been sent. Usually that's just going to be a tickle, which is telling your device that it needs to contact the server to get an update. I've been doing this for a week now, and it's taking its toll on my voice. So, the last thing I want to talk about is location-based services. So again, this is something which is very common for mobiles and very easy to get wrong. I'm not going to spend too much time on here. But this is the most simple way to be able to create a location-based service type app. And you can see we're specifying exactly which provider we want to use, GPS. We're saying we want to get every single update. And generally speaking, this is not a good implementation. When you're doing this, you need to figure out how often do you need updates, what happens if your preferred provider isn't available, how accurate do you really need to be, and what is the impact of that going to be on your battery life. And the other thing is, what happens when the location jumps? When you're first getting a GPS signal, it can be really, really jumpy. So if you're only getting updates every 5 minutes and the first one is way off, how do you deal with that? So start off by figuring out what the lowest frequency of updates is. Excuse me. So you can see here we're specifying 5 minutes and 1,000 meters. Next thing we do is use criteria to select the right location provider. Here we're saying we want to be very accurate, and we don't require any other special features. God. So, by using criteria, we're able to provide a much better solution that's able to provide the best possible provider rather than assuming a particular solution. A good way to be able to get good results as quickly as possible is to implement a backoff pattern. What we're going to do here is specify multiple receivers so that we can get results as quickly as possible, as accurate as possible, and then once we have that, back off to a more reasonable, less frequent updates. So we start by doing what I said not to do. We're going to ask for every single update, and we're going to do it using both the course provider and the find provider. And the reason we can get away with this is if you look at the implementation, for the course provider, we only want the first update. So we know the course provider tends to be faster. So we want to get a data point as quickly as we can so we can display a location on the map. So we get that, and then we straight away remove it. We also, at the same time, are going to listen for every update until we get within a usable accuracy. So as soon as the accuracy is better than 10 meters, we remove the frequent updates and add the predefined less frequent updates. And so what this does is it means that we're able to have something which is as accurate as possible, as quickly as possible, but then it can be as efficient as possible once we've got that initial service has been done. So, my voice thanks us that we are nearly towards the end. Those who were paying attention earlier probably noticed that there was only 4 virtues that I described. And that is because the 5th I like to keep towards the end. And really, it's what all of this is about. What we want you to do is create apps that are epic. The reason there's no picture is because it's the logo for your applications. We want you to create things that are legendary, things which people will talk about, things which will bring you on stage at next year's Google Developer Day, things which we simply can't ignore because they're too impressive, they're too game-changing. And really what we're saying is don't be satisfied with good. Don't just create yet another app which is a variation of mobile, a variation of a website, which is a me too for what someone else is doing. Try and come up with ways in which some of the new hardware features, some of the new paradigms around mobile are able to create something that's truly, truly incredible. Create something unique. create new paradigms, things like Shazam and Layer, which have created apps which simply couldn't exist before the mobile devices like Android and iPhone came out to make them possible. Generally speaking, respect your users, respect the system, create something epic, think big. Thank you very much. Now, first thing I want to mention that Pavel Patrick was listed as a co-presenter. We've actually moved him to a slightly different presentation later today with Justin Matson. So if you're interested in hearing what he has been working on with Inmate, that's definitely something you should check out later today. Now, I think we probably have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I do have some barcodes for people which ask good questions. So if you're in the challenge, now would be a really good time to come up with some good questions. Yes. How can you respond to the user feedback in market? So at the moment, that's a bit of a problem. So there's no direct mechanism within market to respond to users. What some people have chosen to do is either to create a market user, which they will then update with particular responses if it's something which a lot of people have specified. Generally speaking, we'd like to encourage people to encourage users to send direct feedback. So make sure you have a website link and an email link within the market listing to make it easier for users to get directly in contact. Sorry, any other questions? Yes? I have a Nexus 1. If you want to see it, by all means. Yeah? The other one. The other one is the Galaxy tab, which I also have. So if you want to check out the Galaxy tab, a bunch of us will have one over in the office hours later this afternoon. Any other questions? No? Okay, perfect. In that case, thank you very much. Those of you who ask questions, please come at the front. I'll give you a barcode if you're interested in. Otherwise, I'll let you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.